Hello, Professor Feitel in class. For my project and paper, I looked at gun policy, and I have a PowerPoint. The introduction slide says Gun Policy, Policy Analysis Brief by Teddy Reynolds. So I'm looking at the history of gun policy. On September 13th, 1994, President Bill Clinton signed the assault weapons ban. This legislation was known as the Public Safety Use Protection Act, and it passed Congress by a very narrow margin, in part because of opposition by the NRA. This legislation prohibits a manufacturer from making semi-automatic firearms and large-capacity magazines for civilian use. The House voted in favor of this legislation by a vote of 216 to 214, and the Senate voted in favor of this legislation by a vote of 52 to 48. On May 3rd, 1994, three former presidents, two Republicans, Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford, and one Democrat, Jimmy Carter, co-authored a letter in favor of the Public Safety Use Protection Act, describing it as essential to the public safety. And Ronald Reagan also, on his own, wrote to individual Republican lawmakers seeking their backing for the legislation. Also looked at the background on recent gun policy proposals, in particular what was said in the textbook, and it describes how President Obama had the intentions of a gun reform campaign, but was unsuccessful in part because of what the text describes as policy actors fearing the wrath of the NRA. The textbook also goes into detail about former shootings, the 2012 Sandy Hook school shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, and the 2016 Orlando, Florida Pulse nightclub shooting, and how it did not end up leading to any kind of legislation, in part because the NRA was not interested in any kind of gun policy concession. Also looked at gun death statistics, looking at 2017, where it caused more deaths by gun violence in the United States than most developed countries and even some underdeveloped countries. The United States has the 28th highest rate of gun violence in the world at 4.43 deaths per 100,000 people. And this is far greater than other wealthy countries and some lower income countries. Compared to Canada, which has a 0.47 per 100,000 people amount of gun deaths, the United States has a rate of 10 times that, with their 4.43 deaths per 100,000 people. And it is 29 times as high as Denmark, which has a 0.15 deaths per 100,000 people. And NPR, the website that I looked at this information, it cited a 2017 study which was produced by the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation that calculated what to expect a country's gun violence death rate to be based on socio-economic status. Per this institute, the United States should see a death rate of only 0.46 deaths per 100,000 people. And then when also looking at states that were discussed in the article, it talks about Washington, D.C., which has a rate of 16.34 deaths per 100,000 people. It's the highest in the nation. The website describes Louisiana as second highest with 10.68 deaths per 100,000 people due to gun violence. And Texas and Ohio are both close to the national average at 4.74 to 100,000. And Ohio at 4.60 to 100,000 people. And they both are states that experienced a deadly mass shooting just a year ago in August of 2019. those in favor of gun reforms, through some of the sites that I looked at, Japan is often brought up as a model for those in favor of gun reform, but looking into a lot of the research done on Japan and what kind of country it is, it's not a pro-gun country, so it's not a great example. There are better examples. In particular, some of the research that I found was Iceland is a good example. It's a very pro-gun country, but it has very serious steps to be able for citizens to own weapons. So that is why those who argue in favor of gun reform, looking at Japan, it's a flawed argument, and a better argument would be to argue that we could, while we are much bigger than Iceland, we could follow what's been successful in their countries and try and figure how to make it work for us. And then flawed pro-gun arguments, in particular looking at the NRA. Recently, over bump stocks, the NRA was in favor, but after Las Vegas, they started pushing back that maybe a ban on bump stocks is appropriate. The only issue is that when the Trump administration wanted to go forward with a ban on all bump stocks, the NRA argued that it was a punishment for responsible gun owners. But looking at the ATF website, this legislation or policy is just expanding on what is already in place through the gun registry. But it's simply not true that a responsible gun owner is being punished for others' actions. It's a smart policy. So it's a flawed argument for the National Rifle Association. For a policy recommendation, if you look at all of these different countries, while they're not, they're very different than ours, we could, as a country, look at what's been successful there. There are countries that support gun rights. In particular, Switzerland and Iceland are two examples. I obviously already discussed Iceland a little bit. But they're probably the best example to look at, even if they're a much smaller country. They go through a very rigorous process, and it's something that I think could be successful. And that's where I conclude with my final statement. I think as we've gone through this class, we've looked at the importance of policy proposals that are successful, and it requires bipartisanship. It goes back, and it's similar to what was looked at in 1994, but we're a different country than we were 26 years ago. So in 2020, I propose that from what I've researched on other countries and found when it comes to gun death statistics, I think a potential successful proposal would be over a 7-week period where we follow the lead of Iceland with psychological exams, and then a gun exam, a test, and then then the range similar to Iceland, who spends a whole day out there, and then seeing if they can pass. So it's similar. I think throughout this class we have learned about the importance of public policy, and throughout this research it is clear that a bipartisan agreement balances pro-gun safety concerns and pro-gun rights concerns. because taking into account both sides is important. So I want to thank everybody, and I will post this PowerPoint. Take care. Thanks.